Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. Look at that. It is the morning after, the morning before, the night after, the night before, whatever the hell it is. It is Thursday, the 17th day of April, and we're heading for a long holiday weekend in this part of the world for the Easter celebrations. And so it'll be interesting to see how the conversations turn around the table of this weekend with families, etc., and the effect it might have on the federal election campaign. I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And let's get right to the table. And just in case you're wondering what the hell the sound effects are in the background, we're joined by Tim Hudak, joining us from the Niagara region here in Ontario and out of doors. That's a nice setting there. And away we go. Former leader of the provincial PC party and the partner at Council Public Affairs. Kathleen Wynne is here. She is our former premier of Ontario. And Keith Leslie here for Queen's Park Observer and commentator at CH Television and a longtime journalist here in Toronto, joining us from Nova Scotia. And John Wright is our founding veteran pollster. And just, you know, you don't have to, you look kind of comfortable out there. How's the weather in Niagara, Tim? That looks nice.
Yeah, you know what? I'm working from the Niagara House today, then down for the weekend. Get to see my mom later today, too, which I'm excited to see. Yeah, it's like a gorgeous spring day. So I love when I get to escape what I'll always say is home. And just hang out here on the patio and join you. And I apologize for the woodpecker sound in the background from time to time. That's
all right. We'll punctuate the entire conversation with the sounds of Canadian nature. And for those of you listening on the podcast platforms, John, you'll appreciate I've got my Avro long sleeve T-shirt on, you being honorary colonel with the RCAF, and I'm wearing my Canada Maple Leaf cap. So that's just been the routine. Kathleen Wynne, just your take, and we don't have to dwell too long on it, on the French leaders debate last night. By all accounts, nobody made any real mistakes except Mr. Singh got a little bit crusty with the moderator.
He did. He got pretty frustrated towards the end, and I get that. He's kind of been pushed to the side in this election. But I thought that Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre did what they needed to do. Obviously Mark Carney's French is the weakest. He acknowledges that. He knows that. But I felt that he was doing what I used to do in French class sometimes. He said what he needed to say, and he didn't say any more because he knew if he was going to say more, he was going to get into trouble in terms of vocabulary, syntax, or whatever. But he held his own very well, I thought. And I watched it in French and English. I went back and forth to the translation. Pierre Poilievre, he held himself in check. He didn't get hot. He stayed very calm. And it'll be interesting to see whether he can do that again in the English debate. But and Monsieur Blanchet just held forth. He was all over the place, and he was the most passionate, but also the least relevant in terms of the overall issue. I think overall election.
And Tim, we've talked about this before, and in particular when we got into the election here in Ontario, and your commentary on being in that position behind the podium. Just one of the things that occurs to me is that people were, and as Kathleen pointed out, people were a little not surprised, but they noted the posture of Mr. Poilievre in as much as he wasn't the attack dog that people probably expected. And that's a lot of what I heard from commentary prior to the debate. If he comes out tonight and takes that posture, is that good or bad? Because I can see somebody saying, well, in Quebec, you talk like this, and the rest of the country, you talk like this.
Yeah, well, top level, I thought it was a good debate. Like, I speak no French. I had 21 years in the Ontario legislature. I could have taken French lessons. I kept putting it off to tomorrow, and tomorrow never arrived. And so I don't have any direct observations, from understanding what actually transpired. But number one, I thought all the leaders actually executed what I think they needed to do, and they should feel good about carrying out on their plan. And it looked like an actual genuine solid debate. To your question, Dave, yeah, I thought Poilievre executed quite well. Two things I really liked. I liked the way he, carried himself, looking like prime minister, where, especially when it comes to women voters, he's been seen as just too hot, too angry. And number two observation I'd say is I'm pleased that he stuck to his guns on some issue that may not be as palatable to Quebecers. He was very strong on oil and gas pipelines. He was a defender of nuclear, and also using notwithstanding clause to make sure that criminals who commit multiple murders actually serve consecutive sentences. To answer your question, will he act that way tonight? I think he's going to be very conscious to demonstrate he's got the chops from a policy point of view, but also from a leadership point of view. I think you'll see the same posture.
Keith, the question around always debates is not so much about performance, but the 1A topic is the format. And in this case, it was a bit of a departure from the regular format. I like the idea of the moderator stepping in and pressing on a question. I know Tim doesn't care for the moderator fact checking, but I think at some point we got to, otherwise, they just run off and they answer questions that weren't asked. So in this case, I think it kind of worked.
I like the format overall, the 45-second limits, the 35, and then the question open debate. But him, again, take off glasses, look concerned, and put it right to them. No, let's get back on top. Asked about jobs and how you're going to help people who lose their jobs because of the tariffs. And Poilievre went off topic, talking a little bit about building homes. And the moderators, let's talk about jobs, get back to that. I think overall the debate was good. My French, despite being, born and raised in northern New Brunswick, surrounded by Acadians, my French was not good enough. I tried. I had to go to the translated one right away, and it makes it tough to really get the nuances of what they're saying. But overall, what I got and what seems to be the consensus is that nobody screwed up. Carney's French isn't that strong, but it was pretty darn good and better than the last Liberal leaders debate that he participated in. And, he didn't get any knives that stuck. They took a lot of blows, but nothing really stuck or hurt him. Well, Poilievre, as everyone has noted, had, tried to, and he did. He stayed calm. He stayed more prime ministerial, if you want to describe it that way. But is it too little too late? Even if he does come out in the English language debate tonight and stay with that calm, cooler demeanor, is it too little too late after he's been so hot for the last 3 years and so, targeting it on the attack dog motive? Can dialing it back at this late in the campaign do it? Can anything actually change the momentum that we've seen in the campaign since it started, of the Liberals rising in the polls, the NDP flattening right out, and the Conservatives slipping further and further behind the Liberals? Can anything happen in an English language debate tonight and in the next less than 2 weeks that will really change that momentum? And I'm not so sure there is. I mean, Poilievre has to, again, I think, come out, try and stick as much to policy as he can, which he's done so far very well, and keep it off the leadership issue. But when it comes to the leadership issue, and pretty well everyone they interviewed in the streeters they did for the French language debate, pretty much everybody said it's the tariffs. They're concerned about the economy and the tariffs. Everyone is worried about that. And so that comes to that leadership question. And there's just been no question that since the beginning of the campaign, Carney wins on that leadership question.
So, John, what's more significant in terms of pushing the needle? Is it the debate or the actual holiday weekend where families and friends will be sitting around and this will be kitchen table conversation, I think?
It's a bit of both, Dave, because there are a lot of people who just don't watch the debates. What they rely upon is what they hear the next day, what they read the next day, their conversations with their family and friends that they'd be engaged with. So whenever we come across an election where there's like a Thanksgiving weekend or something like this, we always say that there's going to be discussion at the table. So I think it's really important for both of those things to inject it, especially after the English language debate tonight. From a polling point of view, I don't think it shows up till probably next Tuesday or Wednesday in the polling. These overnight polls are ridiculous to try and gain anything from. I mean, there's a whole methodology behind, rolling up 3 nights and, sample sizes and the margin of error. So I really will wait till next Tuesday or Wednesday to see if any of this has, come to bear or whether it's all baked in. The last thing I would say, though, is that when I look at these debates, I always remember what my mother said the first time I was on an Ottawa show, flown in the old days, and I was up for CTV with the Parliament Hill in the background doing a show. And I called my mom on the airport and I said, because it was live then, what did you think? And she said, well, I don't know what your father and I don't really know what you said, but you looked really good and your shoes were really shiny.
Way to go, Mom.
And I think all of us who have been on television get the same thing. If I'm on CP24 in Toronto or City News or something, and it's playing in a bar or in somebody's home, they always go, "Saw you on TV," and then you kind of go, or I did before. You go, "Yeah, did you hear what I said?" It was kind of like, "No, but you look really good." So I'm one of those who says that for those who tune in even briefly, who are not one of the pundits, who are just the regular audience, they're not going to pay a lot of attention oftentimes to what is actually said. They're going to look at the demeanor of what's going on. And so when I view that, I think Mr. Carney had to hold his own last night, got out okay. Mr. Poilievre, in much the same way, was different. He was quieter. He wasn't the attack dog. And then you look at the other three who right now, from the polling point of view, are really not that important to where we're headed, but except Blanchard in Quebec, but he's, they're not doing very well there. So we'll see whether or not this had any impact. But I think from a demeanor point of view, it looked pretty good from anybody who tuned in. And from a policy point of view, it'll get sorted out over the next 24 hours and then be talked about at the dinner table. And I suspect by next Wednesday or so, most people will be locked in terms of where they want to go.
Kathleen, Wynne, I just want
Yeah.
to
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to ask you, because as all of this is playing out, I'm watching the response and the posture, as John points out, of Liberals on the sidelines. They're kind of ticking it off every time and saying, "I wish the election were today," kind of feel to this, because even when you look at the seat modeling and the aggregators, it's getting closer in terms of the two front parties. So there's a feeling of the bubble's going to burst if we don't take advantage of what's in front of us right now. What's your read of the Liberal posture, and just in terms of the supporters, those people who are working the campaigns, in terms of we got to get this over with?
So I've been out in about 6 or 7 campaigns knocking on doors. Yesterday I was in Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte with the Liberal candidate Rose Zacharias. And there's definitely an element of that, Dave. Could we just have the election yesterday? It'd be great. But they're feeling good, Dave. They're feeling positive. They're getting a really good response to Carney at the door. Yesterday in the poll that we were doing, Rose got at least 3 conservatives who were saying, I'm moving to Liberals this time. Now, that's not a riding that is a sure thing by any stretch of the imagination. And the Liberals will have to do very well to win that riding. But she's a great candidate. And, she's knocking on doors. She's got a really good team. They're energized, Dave. They're feeling positive. And I think that the debate last night is going to, not that it's going to be a huge shot in the arm, but there's going to be a sigh of relief. Everything went well. We know we feel the English debate will be even stronger. And I think people will have a good day today. I just wanted to make 2 quick comments on the debate. One, there was a moment when, and Tim, you sort of referred to it, when Pierre Poilievre talked about imposing pipelines. And the distinction between what he said and what Mark Carney said, I think, is important. It's certainly important in terms of our relationship with Indigenous people, the Canadian government's relationship. What Mark Carney said was that they would work with Indigenous people. What Poilievre said was there's going to be an imposition of these projects. And that's a fine policy difference, and it won't be picked up necessarily, but we need to pay attention to that, because that's the kind of policy decision that's going to be really problematic. If Pierre Poilievre becomes the prime minister, it's going to make that relationship with Indigenous people very difficult, and those projects will not go ahead in the way that he thinks they will. So that's one point. The second one is, this is about the debate commission. I don't understand how True North and Rebel Media got their question. I just don't get it. They're advocacy, nasty organizations that really have no business asking questions with real journalists who are trying to get real information for people.
Well, the commission, Tim, just had a bad week. I mean, when you pile it all on.
Yeah. Look, I think the only decision they made that I like is, 2. All right. So I think Steve Paikin is world-class moderator. So I'm happy he's doing the English debate. Premier Wynne and I were on stage with him during our debate. I think he could write a textbook on this. So I like that one. And then finally, they kicked the Green Party off. I mean, honest to goodness, right? That two-headed leadership, they may as well start every answer with greeting Earthlings. I just have no time for that national party, which meant, I guess 20% more for the real candidates. All right, where was I? But honest to God, isn't it time? I don't think this commission is working. I don't like the way they make decisions. It's taxpayer subsidized. I'd be more confident putting it directly in the hands of leading journalism outfits and up the quality.
Well, how do you explain their ruling that the morning of, first of all, the morning of the debate, little late in the game for a commission with a $6 million budget, but how do you explain that to them, that you didn't fit the rules because you're only running candidates in 2/3 of the ridings, when the Bloc is only running candidates in one province? The rest of us, none of us on this podcast can vote for them, and yet they will be in the English language debate tonight. Why can't that same, maybe they'll get a letter late today? No, of course
they have 4% of the vote.
That's right.
Yes.
They meet the criteria.
Right?
Yeah.
They meet the criteria. But you're not running candidates in at least 2/3 of the riding, or it's supposed to be 90%. The rule is 90% of the ridings. They're not even doing 2/3. But on the other hand, I think the Greens were wrong here. They tried to be too cute by half by saying they endorsed all those candidates, but then didn't actually sign up. They had within 90%, but then ended up somewhere around 2/3 because they didn't actually sign them all in. Both were wrong in this place, but the commission itself, it just looks like there were some dumb decisions there. And it was, I'll give credit to Chantal Hébert on the National when she pointed out that, and the NHL schedule comes out in July.
Exactly.
That they had at the last minute to move this game to avoid the Habs' last game of the season, as if they wouldn't. Anyway, that one in itself, right there, that blunder in itself, that it took them to the last minute and have two parties ask to have it done. That was ridiculous. Parties shouldn't have had to ask. Don't go up against the Habs game. It's just stupid. Just stupid.
And Keith, do you buy that the Green decided to endorse, non-conservative candidates, or they just couldn't get their act together and get enough genuine candidates?
Oh, I think they seem to have had candidates, but they didn't sign them down. So I'm thinking the fact that they actually had people who were willing to run, but that in the end they thought they were going to play it, strategically and withdraw so that the progressive vote would go Liberal. I don't see how that's going to work for them, but it's as I say, if that's not the case, I mean, if it was just a matter of they pretended to have the endorsement, they pretend to endorse all these people who really hadn't signed them up, that's even worse. And something else that the debate commission should have figured out, because I think the deadline for that 90% of candidates was April 7th. So why are we talking about it at this point? Way too late. So the commission clearly did not do its job on so many fronts. But again, perhaps Tim's right, the most egregious being, going up against the hockey game. Yeah. But Rebel, not to make too light of it, Kathleen's point about Rebel News and them asking questions. Yeah. Come on, what are you doing? And at least Jagmeet Singh refused to take the questions, and the other candidates should have done the same thing. Yeah. I, as a reporter, used to leave. I remember, I'm so old. There was a time, you people will remember him, when the neo-Nazi Ernst Zundel claimed to be a reporter.
Yep.
And he would show up at news conferences and start with his yellow hard hat on and his groups behind him supporting him. And he would start asking questions. And I remember, I think it was Robert Kaplan was a federal minister. And he started answering. I said, "You're not going to answer him, are you?" I literally called up and he said, "Yes." And I went up and I took down my microphone and tape deck and said, "Well, I'm not going to be recording your answer to this." I mean, even then that was offensive. And to have them this many, I'm not saying they're neo-Nazis, but they're certainly propagandists. They have a paid agenda and they raise funds to promote their agenda. It's not journalism, not even close to being journalism.
Yeah, John Wright, the whole, again, the conversation around the debate had little to do with the substance coming out of it. It was focused on the actual detail, the organization, the format, all of these things. And it brings us back to the perennial question when we get to the debates. Is it worth the time in the campaign to be taking effectively 3 days off out of the campaign, maybe more because there's prep work to be done, rather than actually being out there knocking on doors?
Well, sure. But in elections, you have to take part in one or two of them. And this was, one that had to be done. So when you're a federal leader, you have to go into that arena. You have to put yourself on the line with everybody else, and people want to see what you look like. Remember, there's so many people in this country who don't tune into these things, don't tune into elections, but there's a number of others who want to see what they want to say. Here's what I think people don't want to tune into, and that is a bunch of people screaming and yelling at each other. I think, there's been this whole view since Brian Mulroney did that rare knockout that you're supposed to talk over people. I mean, the municipal debates are ridiculous when you see them on television, because, there's like 7 or 8 people in there. You can't get a word in. After a while, who would want to be held a prisoner in there, much like those of us who are made to watch this, when you could be watching a hockey game? And I think that's what it comes down to for me. What I liked about last night was it was very controlled but engaging. You didn't have people screaming and yelling over each other. We actually got an interesting debate on topics where you could contrast, one versus the other and how they looked. I would also say that I go back to the debate that was held at Roy Thompson Hall, I think it was, with Richard Griffiths, and that was in the 2015 campaign, and Justin Trudeau had, taking on Stephen Harper. It was respectful. It was controlled. There was a way in which you actually listened to the leader say something and get something out. So I think outside of the commission and all the ridiculous things that were going on there, what I really enjoyed about last night, as a bit of a political geek, but also someone who's seen this for a long time, was an engaging moderator, but such to the point that you didn't allow them to interact so much that other people would kind of tune out. So I think that's the most important thing. If Steve Paikin can control the English debate tonight to that degree, well, then it is worth it for candidates to go into an arena like that and to get their point across. But I don't know how in today's age you could avoid it without having a huge controversy.
Okay, well, while the debate was going on, the French debate, that is, I'm sitting on my phone and I'm looking down and I see this story pop into my feed from the New York Times, and it's all about the Therme development at Ontario Place. And there's a whole bunch of things that are flying around here, Keith, in terms of my response to that story. Good on the Times for doing the investigation. Actually, it prompted me to subscribe to the New York Times. So there I went and made sure I did that. But the questions around Therme are extraordinary, to the point where it's only coming to light now, only because New York Times did good journalism on this. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean to me that Therme shouldn't be involved at Ontario Place just on the surface of it. But holy shit. I mean, seriously, how did we miss this and not know that this was the state of that company? That, in fact, they misrepresented themselves in no uncertain terms.
Well, what looked to most of us like a really, really shitty deal for taxpayers in the first place, a 95-year lease for prime waterfront land to an Austrian spa company, turns out to, if the New York Times is correct, looks an awful lot more like a con job. I mean, they claim to have 6 of these giant spas operating in Europe and around, and the experience of running them all. And it turns out they had 1 in Bucharest. And yet their company name and even their logo were pretty much the name Therme was a name of the other company that ran 5 other spas in Europe. They had the same name, took the same Venus in a half shell logo, although slightly different coloring. I mean, they really, really misrepresented, it seems intentionally, that they had way more assets than they did, way more experience than they did, when even apparently Infrastructure Ontario uncovered at the time that they only had about €1 million in actual liquidity. So there's a question as to how this process got back. But the New York Times journalism here is great. Basically, it appears that the Ontario government was conned by a company that said it had far more, as I say, experience and assets than it did. And it then turned around and took the contract it got from Ontario. Remember, Ontario taxpayers are on the hook here for hundreds of millions of dollars just in advanced prep work on the West Island and the Ontario Place site to get it ready for Therme to come in and for Live Nation as well. So there's taxpayers are already on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars in this deal. It never did seem to be a good deal for taxpayers. But now we have this company that appears, clearly misled the government of Ontario. And, the premier said, well, no, it was all, one company, they bought the other one out. Well, no, if you read into the New York Times article, the one didn't buy the other one out. The owner of the larger Therme company died in a plane crash. And the new company basically seemed to have assumed or just took on under its wing, as it were, a lot of the assets without actually buying anything here. They misrepresented themselves. This makes this, as I say, it was already a bad deal. The Auditor General and the Integrity Commissioner had already told us that it was an unfair process in the first place, that Therme got unacceptable access to government staffers during the process when there wasn't supposed to be any lobbying going on whatsoever. The whole thing stank from the first place. Now it's in a position, I mean, if the New York Times is right here, I think the government's going to have to look at some way of getting out of the contract. And from what I've read so far, if they try and get out of it, they're on the hook again for more tens of millions of dollars in upfront costs just to bail out Therme. So, I mean, it's going to then take a court case. They're going to have to try and prove, if they are going to try and get out of it, it would take suing Therme to prove fraud or some sort of thing like that. That's going to be time consuming, expensive. You have a West Island's been denuded of 800 trees. It's basically a massive construction site, all fenced off. Is that we wouldn't have thought they could have made it worse than having it sit there empty for 14 or 15 years. And apparently it is now worse. So what could happen here? So the government's got to move quickly on this. And the premier really, really did seem to try and he looked very uncomfortable. He tried to blame Infrastructure Ontario. He tried to downplay the importance of it. No, we're not investigating. We're just going to double check. I just want to make sure it passed the smell test. Well, I think it was Merritt Stiles says, let me save you the time. It doesn't pass the smell test. It was a good clip by her, and then she's right.
Well, Tim, I think the line in the story that struck me is that the Therme, the company that got the deal here in Ontario, didn't inherit the original company, but it inherited its story. And that was sort of the track they went down. And that there wasn't any transparency. You're all right there? You're not on the train track or anything, right? Just want to make sure you're safe.
That Johnny Cash song, right? I can hear
we're doing the pod. Coming around the bend. So, but in that case, I'll let you respond how you want, but I just think, holy crap, this is how do we not see this coming? Now, I guess you could say, you can't necessarily blame the Ontario government all by itself because other big companies are financing this thing now based on the shell game that started the whole thing.
Well, it's awfully embarrassing all around, right? I mean, it's embarrassing, frankly. Media didn't take this up. Good for the New York Times, but why not here? Quite frankly, it's embarrassing the opposition didn't pick this up. I think it would have been all over this like a dirty shirt on digging around and trying to find some holes. Man, that would have been explosive to leave with that in question period. But most embarrassing to the government, right? It's a crown jewel, new tourism investment. I like the program. I'm a fan. I like the notion. I'd actually called for this when I was in lead of the PC party, that the Science Center was tired. It was so set in the 70s. It's almost like learning more about history than it was about science anymore. And a new rebuild makes sense. Like, I love this theme, but holy cats, you don't want to buy the monorail here, right? Like, this is very, very embarrassing. So what do you do? Number one, I suspect you're far enough down the tracks here, and this company was probably careful and lawyered up that it may be hard to trigger an escape clause without an awful cost. So you got to make it work. So I think Premier Ford should be completely transparent with what the nature of this deal is, what they knew and when, and then is kind of like, just straight talk with folks. Say, we're down this path. We're going to fix it. I believe in this project. I believe this will be an attractor, not only in Ontario, but, from abroad. And we're going to make it with a company and make it happen. In Therme, they just keep getting battered. So I don't know who's doing their public affairs, public relations, but they need to go on the aggressive side and talk about what this is going to mean for average Ontarians, because they just keep getting knocked around. This is a major, major embarrassing step backwards, but you roll up your sleeves, you try to fix it, and just be honest with people.
Well, I'm glad your firm isn't picking up their public affairs. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to comment on it. No offense, but Kathleen.
Well, I think we need to step back just a bit. The front page of the Star, I still get the paper, and the front page of the Star this morning, there was the debate, and there was an article about the emails that the Star has, forced a release of from the Greenbelt issue, and there was the Therme story. This is a government that is not careful in process, right? It doesn't put good processes in place, and it keeps getting into trouble, whether it's Greenbelt, whether it's the Ontario Place, whether it's the autism program, whether it's green energy. Look at a whole lot of bad process in the way this government does business. So I would say fine. I agree with Tim. You know, the premier needs to do a review of this. He said he's going to do a review. I would argue that the opposition, particularly Marit Stiles, has been on this from the beginning and has said there's something wrong here. It's costing too much. It doesn't look right. And yeah, great that the New York Times blew it open. That was going to happen at some point. But, you know, I just think to say, well, that this is a one-off and just treat it as that is a real mistake. This is a government that is saying that it's now going to spend 2 years looking at how to build a ridiculous tunnel under the 401. Well, I'm telling you, folks, we need to pay very close attention to this. It's a ridiculous idea. I don't believe there is a business case for it. And we went through the process of getting a business case, which was there for building high-speed rail above ground to Kitchener-Waterloo and on to London. But to build a tunnel under the 401, who's he going to be talking to? What are the companies going to be saying? Because it's a fantasy. This spa is one thing, but that tunnel under the 401, we better pay close attention, because this is a government who chooses who it talks to very, very judiciously based on who are their friends. And I don't know whether there's more to the Therme story about that, like who got them into the premier's office in the first place. But I really, really think we have to pay attention, because this is not a government that has good due process. They don't have that skill. They don't care about it. And Doug Ford thinks that he can just stand up at a podium, read his teleprompter apology, and that makes it all go away. Well, I think there's a time limit on that. I think you can only do that so many times, and then you start to look like, okay, you really don't know what you're doing. And I think we're getting there.
On Wright, when the Therme story kind of surfaces and people kind of, you know, get their back up about it, there was a real fatigue around it, saying, okay, enough already, let's just get the job done. We're, you know, it's already down the road. And there was a certain spin on the story. Well, but there's a market for this. I heard, you know, Shelley Carroll, city councilor, saying that this morning on the radio. Well, you know, I would like to go and spend $40 and go to the spa. That's not really the point here. The idea being that, do we want to do something great with Ontario Place? For sure. But everybody so far agreeing that the process is the problem. And yes, the premier has gotten himself into trouble in the past and then apologized for it and has bounced back. Does he bounce back from this one?
Well, it depends on how you look at what the future looks like. If this was coming last November or so, I think this would have been a big problem, because it would have fed right into the narrative of an election campaign, and you would have had lots of people trying to peel back the onion. You would have also had, like what we could have is an emboldened group of people who were protesting the change to Ontario Place in the first place, but not just on the government, but then on the city in terms of what they want to do. There may be some of that now comes as a result of that. So in terms of the immediate effect on the government's stature in the province, I can't see it, you know, having a huge impact. Secondly, it really is a very GTA, Greater Toronto Area story. I mean, this doesn't play up north. It is a very local, entangled type issue. But I would say this, it also takes away from a whole lot of other things the government wants to talk about. We're not into the legislature in any way, and this is now going to occupy a fair bit of time. I don't know whether or not it gets referred anywhere after this, but if it is in the House, it's going to take up a focus of the two major leaders. The other thing, too, is that I think all of us, especially those who have served in the legislature, it takes a bit of a demeanor to deal with this. I'm not sure, based on what I've seen yet, that the NDP leader and is up to that in a way. This is a pretty serious thing. In the old days, it would have called for somebody with a very calm voice, someone who probably had been a lawyer at some time, someone who would stand up, and we've been in the legislature at times when this has happened, when the rest of the place goes quiet and you listen and you just kind of start unraveling the onion peel, because I think there's enough there that this could be something that gnaws away at the government. If anything, they're going to have to answer more questions about it. Whether they're forced to do something about it, I don't know. But the reality is it's not going away. And part of that is because it affects other jurisdictions as well. And people are going to put the pressure on them to see whether or not they've made the right decision.
Yeah, Kathleen, if I can predict anything, that based on the way investigative reporting goes, that first story is not the last story.
Correct.
That in fact there is other stuff to be told here, and the Times would be working on it and release it as it sees fit. My question here is, and I agree with everybody. I mean, on the surface of this in and of itself around the Therme Ontario Place Science Centre issue is a real issue and a problem for the government. There's no way of getting around it. Here's my problem. We can point to all of these issues that come up, and at the heart of them is Infrastructure Ontario. We've got Therme Ontario Place. We've got Metrolinx now is still an issue cross town. We've got the trial, the court case that went on around St. Mike's Hospital procurement and IO's involvement and all that. They are at the center of every one of these major screw ups around procurement that is not transparent, despite the fact that in each one of those cases, and I'm sure there are others, there was advice to say, there's a problem here that we should be paying attention to, and somebody's not paying attention to it, and it's the same crew.
Well, I think each of those situations is different, Dave. And I would say in terms of this Ontario Place issue and the Greenbelt, I think that yes, infrastructure is involved in Ontario Place, but the buck for those issues stops with the process that is designed and is authorized in the Premier's office. There is no doubt in my mind that the Premier's office knew what was going on with the Greenbelt. I mean, obviously there are questions about that, and that's still under investigation. I'm just saying, my guess is that the kind of devil may care, we're just going to do this, we're going to, I mean, he talks like that. He says, I'm going to get a bulldozer and I'm going to open up the ring of fire. Well, that doesn't happen, but that's the attitude that process is dull, process is not necessary. And I think that's how we've gotten into trouble. What role Infrastructure Ontario has played in each one of those situations, I think, is different. But the government has to be, the Premier and his government have to be held accountable for these questions. I mean, I stood up, Tim, how many times did I stand up and apologize for the gas plants, right? I mean, the issue came right to Dalton's desk and then to my desk when I became the Premier, had to take accountability for it, had to talk about it and explain it and take responsibility for it, so that was an issue. And I think it's the same with these issues, Dave. The Premier is going to have to take responsibility at some point. And look, I mean, maybe it wasn't Ontario Place, but there was a good reason that this Premier wanted to have his election early. The Greenbelt was part of that for sure. And who knows what else he didn't want to have to deal with now. He wanted to get it out of the way, get the election. He's got his mandate. I don't think he's going to pay a huge price on the Ontario Place issue unless it is prosecuted, as John said, in the House. But he needs to take responsibility for it. And as I say, going forward, folks, we need to pay attention to this government that does not understand good process.
Well,
but Tim,
Kathleen's point about, I just want to say Kathleen's point about process. Go ahead.
Let me just suggest, though, that the process lives at Infrastructure Ontario. So to me, that is at the heart of every one of these other stories. And it's not about the government of the day, because, the St. Mike's thing happened when you were sitting in the front bench.
Exactly. And I get that. But there's a minister who has responsibility for Infrastructure Ontario. The government does have responsibility for good or bad process. And what I'm saying is we have to take responsibility for it. And when there are repeated mess ups like this one, the government has to be held accountable for that. Sorry, Keith, you wanted to get in.
Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
Oh, sorry. I was looking forward to Kathleen's point about this government in process. Their next big piece of legislation is to eliminate as many permits as possible in the province. What's that going to be? That's going to be environmental permits more than anything. And we already saw that, again, back to the Ontario Place thing. What's one of the first things they did was exempted from any environmental assessment process for that the work, because we knew it wasn't going to go abide by any environmental rules. So this government is hell bent on getting things done quicker and faster and overruling the regulations essentially by wiping them out. So I would want to keep a very close eye going forward on exactly what they mean by permits that they're looking to get rid of. But it's a heck of a lot of them, and it's all basically back to this: let's get stuff done as quickly as possible. And that, clearly there's an issue. Something needs to be done to get housing built quicker than it's being built in the last 2 years. What does that mean? Wiping out all the permits at the municipal level? Does it mean imposing a provincial mandate? I don't know. But for them to wipe out permits to make business go quicker, we got to keep a very close eye on that, because as I say, I think the number one danger in this permit wiping out would be in the environment.
Tim, the whole idea of speeding things up, I think that speaks to a frustration among a lot of people who are sitting here looking at, again, I go back to Crosstown, how long it's taken to do all that stuff. And I realize that's not necessarily a permitting issue, but on the horizon is the Ring of Fire. And I spent last week up in Nunavut with the mining symposium, and permits. It doesn't matter what government, they get in the way of actually getting the job done. There has to be a healthy balance there. So I think that the Ford government is probably on the right track to say, let's speed this up, because we got to get that stuff out of the ground in the Ring of Fire. But at the same time, we got to do it so that we're not making the environment worse, because it's going to kick up all that methane in the air because it's on boglands and all that sort of thing. So there has to be some balanced approach. But if there isn't transparency around it, they run the risk of ending up in the same situation they're in with Therme.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance, right? It's an excellent point there, Dave. And look, I mean, I'm right now not too far away from the Welland Canal. Canada used to be really good at building massive infrastructure, 400 series of highways, a transcontinental railway. But the pendulum has swung so far that it takes forever to build something, right? I mean, look, oil and gas pipelines, there's permitting, there's politics. We think also, right, about how long it takes to get a housing development built. In some municipalities, a decade. Meanwhile, prices skyrocket. So it's not a matter of, one extreme or the other, but surely the pendulum must swing back into balance. And to the earlier point, a few things on the table. Your greatest strength can also be your greatest vulnerability. So Doug Ford, tremendous instinct politician. I mean, we don't have anybody in Ontario's history that actually won 3 elections in a row with an increased share of the vote. Doug Ford today, very different from Doug Ford in 2018, but it does also mean that you can make mistakes in overriding process, a big vulnerability. So what do you do? Number one, I think you need to hold these agencies to account. If they don't do the job, then you need to replace people, and the minister has a responsibility to do that depending on the agency we're speaking about. Number two, I think he needs somebody in his office who's going to be the keeper of the flame for the brand to, stand up and say, hey, look what happened in the past. We got to get some better thinking around how often we may just run down a path and say, devil may care. Third, it strikes me that they have a tendency, and I think some of the agencies are reined in, whether it's Infrastructure Ontario, Metrolinx, somewhere here, Therme, maybe a bit too cautious, maybe a bit more, shining some light and letting them speak and confessing when things go off the rails, and then saying how we're going to fix it and hold them to that. I think that they're holding back too much on the communication side.
I think that's
I love the Blue Jay chorus in the background there, by the way.
But that's such an important point that Tim just made, because the Eglinton Crosstown, look, I was still in the legislature. I was still representing Don Valley West when this started to be a real problem. It was a problem before, don't get me wrong, but it started to be a real problem. And the biggest issue was that we couldn't get a minister to talk to us. We couldn't get Carolyn Mulroney was the Minister of Transportation. She wouldn't talk about what was going on with Metrolinx. Nobody had a clue. We were dealing with the storage facility in Thorncliffe Park. No information. And I know for sure that Metrolinx had been muzzled. That doesn't help anybody. You need to have information, but this government holds everything to its chest and makes it very, very difficult for people to really learn what's going on. So I think they do themselves a disservice because of that.
John, the whole the other side of this is, and it might have been the first piece of legislation that was introduced after the throne speech, and Vic Fedeli talking about the interprovincial trade barriers. That should have been the headline this week for them, shouldn't it? You're muted. You're on mute, John.
Yeah, Tim's got birds in the background. I'm a dog.
You got the dog. No.
Yeah, I know. He barked. I tried to cut her off at the pass there. Yeah, it should have been a good week for the government, where they would have had not only the, bits and pieces of the throne speech, but they would have been laying into the tariff issues and all of this stuff dealing with interprovincial trade, of which there's a handful of provinces really engaged in it, and others are not yet. But nonetheless, that could have been the cornerstone. And as a result, we're talking about this in the following days, which is a big distraction. I think we have to remember, though, that this, what we're talking about today, is intermittent, whereas the American situation and what Donald Trump wants to do and what Donald Trump is doing south of the border is every day. So, you know, what could happen today could be blown off the stage tomorrow and put on the back burner. And I think you're right. The issue for the government of the day is where they were with the throne speech, emphasizing the impact of the United States and Donald Trump's tariffs on industry, with the Honda plant that they had to get some confirmation on that it was not going to be moving from Alliston, with the fallout after the federal campaign. So let's assume for a moment that the president has laid off Mark Carney and stopped calling us the 51st state, which has actually led to a bit of a vacuum in the ballot question that was for the Liberals going into this campaign. And affordability has now become more of an issue, benefiting the Conservatives to a degree. But once the federal election is finished, the question then is, do we revert back to what the press secretary for the White House and the president said only 48 hours ago? And that is, you know what? President's being distracted, but his whole idea about the 51st state being in place in Canada is really what he thinks and what he'd rather have. So this may be an important issue today in the absence of all of that. But I think, once this election is finished federally, I think we're going to be into those issues, and it's going to be hard for issues like this to take center stage.
Yeah, and I think ultimately there'll be a sort of a national exhale. Just we're through the campaigns, but at the same time, Keith, there is still the what's next in all of that. And I think that's where the real challenge for all governments at all levels, particularly the territories, the provinces, and the federal government, are going to have to then come out of that campaign and say, now what? And what do we do in lockstep? How do we manage this with all the bullshit going on with, Western sovereignty and as Tim points out, in terms of how, are we going to get pipelines through Quebec, and does that piss them off, or does it actually upend the agenda with the First Nations and so on? That might be the biggest challenge, is actually pulling that group together and having them sing from the same hymnal over the next year, 18 months.
Well, the way Blanchette was talking last night, I mean, I know he's not the premier, but the way he was talking is that Quebec is its own economy and wants to remain its own economy. And so if we're trying to get, united 13 economies into one, well, we're going to get 12 at best, according to him. I don't think that's realistic. I think, Alberta and Quebec are going to have to be pushed into making some deals here. And when they see, especially, Ontario, and it's easy for Ontario to make these deals with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. I mean, it's a lot easier, right? They're not necessarily easy, but it's a lot easier than to get them with Quebec and Alberta. But this is going to have to be done. But I think the premiers are in a negotiating position, a negotiating stance. I think they all know they're going to have to give up something to get what they want. And apparently, according to some polls, the opposition in Quebec to pipelines is now below 50%. If that's accurate, it means that there could be some openings there, that there could be some way of getting this. And that's what Canada has to mean. The premiers, the federal government all have to work together on something that's going to be a major what next, as you say. Are we going to get a pipeline built? Are we going to get our own economies built so we're shipping together to new markets, or at least to our own markets within Canada? To the point about major infrastructure projects, I remember a few years ago we were in a scrum with the late great Hazel McCallion, and she complained that the last major infrastructure project in Canada was the Confederation Bridge to Prince Edward Island. And by its name, I guess that was made in 1967. And she's right. Name another major infrastructure project in Canada. There's been some minor, light rails and different things, but a major infrastructure project in Canada, we're due for some. And I think it's going to take united provincial and federal governments to get it done. It may not get, the 13 into one, but I think we can get an awful lot of the issues cleared out of the way that we've seen in some of these interprovincial barriers. And the most important one that I've seen, certainly in the memorandums of understanding Ontario signed yesterday, is the labor mobility. If you're a nurse or a doctor in British Columbia or Prince Edward Island or anywhere else, why can't you be a nurse anywhere else in Canada? same with all these sorts of things. So I think those sorts of things are huge. The labor mobility is a massive issue. If they can work out allowing construction crews to move around, again, it's going to make for more business opportunities for everybody. So there's some absolute gains to be made there, but it's going to take some political negotiations and some concessions. Some provinces are going to have to take some pain, but we already know Ontario and Quebec are taking some pain right off the bat from Trump's tariffs. So the rest of Canada is going to have to help out here, and we need a mostly united front, as united a front as we can get.
Before we go, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that we are heading for the Battle of Ontario. And so the Leafs and the Senators will be playing off. But I suggested yesterday, Kathleen, that fight might be closer and a tighter race than what we're seeing in most of the polling in Ontario as far as the federal campaign is concerned. And if in fact the Liberals win a lot of the seats in Ontario, how does that play into that dynamic that Keith was talking about in terms of, we've got the Liberals have a mandate in Ontario, particularly up against Doug Ford's mandate in Ontario.
Well, I don't think it'll be up against, though. I think that I actually think that, to Keith's point about the work that Doug Ford is doing in terms of removing those interprovincial trade barriers, or attempting to, I think that absolutely is consistent and completely aligned with what Mark Carney's talking about in terms of one economy. And it was interesting how many times Blanchet said 13 economies last night. But Carney has been very clear about the one economy. I just want to make one point on this, though. When we talk about provincial, territorial governments and the federal government, Dave, you've just been in Nunavut. We cannot forget that there are Indigenous governments who are asking for government-to-government relationships. Part of the reconciliation process in this country is about that conversation, government to government to government. And so when we talk about permits, the permitting discussion around the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, I can tell you, is very real and alive, and it will be on any project that we try to do in the country. And if we don't start incorporating that into our conscious conversation about these issues, we're going to have a rude awakening when when I say we, the leaders sit down to try to push these projects forward. There has to be a relationship built in order for that government to government conversation to happen.
Yeah, the complexity of just the government in the Arctic, Tim, was fascinating to me and revealing to me. I mean, we got into a whole conversation about the caribou migration and how that is playing so deeply in the territorial politics, overlapping with Manitoba. Nobody outside of that area is talking about it, but how important it is and how tangled it is. So yes, we're going to have to certainly, I think, approach it from that perspective in the context of reconciliation, because that's going to be part of it, right? Raising the economy, making sure there's a good, solid wage economy in these parts of the world, parts of Canada. That's critical. And I think it actually is part of this larger discussion about interprovincial, interterritorial trade and barriers.
Yeah, I agree 100%. We have elements of that in Northern Ontario as well. I mean, we do need to move forward. You try to get as much, support as possible. Poilievre's point in the debate was, if the majority, of Indigenous communities support it, can you have one stop something? But the bottom line for me is making sure those communities benefit in jobs, investment, and they get, a fair share of the royalties to try to align, their ultimate economic benefit with the countries.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting as this all plays out to see how all of a sudden, to some degree, governments are kind of poking their heads up thinking, oh, right, it's not just about us. We've got to kind of have a better, more broad peripheral vision on all of this. All right. Let's leave it there. That was a spirited hour. And so thanks to Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak. Enjoy the beauty of Niagara this weekend on your Easter weekend, Tim. That's good. John Wright is here, our veteran founding pollster, and Keith Leslie. And of course, two things I want to tell you about. We have just launched our program that's related to the trip to Nunavut I took last week. It's called the Arctic Edge. You can find the details at arcticedge.ca, and you can subscribe to the podcast there. And it is, in fact, about the economic development, certainly of the Arctic, particularly of Nunavut, and the role that some of these larger industries are playing in that, particularly mining. And Agnico Eagle is the one, a sponsor behind that programming. So and we have had a fascinating time. Hannah Thibodeau, formerly of CBC, is the host of that show. So, and that will launch the first week of May. But you can go download the trailer, have a listen to it, and subscribe to the show there. Otherwise, if you're listening to this program, obviously on any one of the podcast apps, make sure that you are subscribing. And if you're watching on the YouTube, subscribe to the channel, because you get this and now and next, and they both fall into that feed. All right, that'll do it for us. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your holiday weekend. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.